blackness,
tenebrosity,
evil,
wickedness,
corruption,
sin,
immorality,
devilry,
hell,
unhappiness,
distress,
ignorance,
secrecy.
mystery. What do you think all these words have in common? Were any of these words compelling to you? We found that there are very few universally positive words in this definition, and also that light, good, and day are used as antonyms for darkness. My name is Mónica Llamas.
And I am Florencia Castro, and we're here today to reframe how you think about darkness and your creative process. This is the Poetics of Darkness.
Before we get into details, let's talk about the objectives for today. We will start by looking at typical misconceptions related to darkness and how they impact our current practice. Then, we will expand on the relationship between darkness and light and their value to lighting design. We're also going to touch base on the technical side of lighting recommendations and their implications to conclude with our major goal, which is invite you to rethink about darkness. You probably think it is unusual to talk about darkness as lighting designers, right? However, we consider that lighting design is directly related with the effective use of darkness and contrast. In fact, to understand how to work with light is to comprehend and acknowledge its relationship with darkness and shadow. Darkness has had a unique presence in the way we understand our surroundings. Its ephemeral quality helps us define the character of architectural spaces and the relationship between the elements that integrate it, doing, among other things, that the experience we are living in space becomes memorable. But then, if darkness has such a relevant role, why do you think that we tend to avoid it in our design process or even forget about it? Any thoughts? We'll start with a brief look into context.
What is darkness and how do we understand it? Our idea of darkness has been established and shaped by implied associations based on our culture and our origin. This notion is deeply rooted in our collective consciousness through negative concepts that we have all accepted as universal truths. For example, have you ever used darkness as synonym of an evil power? Have you ever used it to describe something you don't know? Or maybe darkness prevented you from exploring a space. I'm sure we can all relate to these ideas. Likewise, and on the other side of these diagrams, there are false concepts related to how darkness might impact a space, such as the impression of limiting legibility, hinder orientation, or create confusion in our environment. Typically, we understand darkness as an absolute entity opposite to light. Another factor that defines our understanding of darkness and light is related to language. Light tends to be used to describe positive qualities of objects, spaces, or people, whereas darkness is commonly used in a negative context to describe experiences and emotions. In this diagram by Claudia Dodson, you can see how our language is divided when talking about darkness and light, having an ample and rich vocabulary of positive words to refer to light, and on the contrary, not many positive words to refer to darkness, making evident the negative value we attach to it. This association of the language and the clear separation in our vocabulary conditions the way we understand darkness today.
We have also identified that our understanding of darkness has evolved with time. We would like to remind you that in the past, we used to have a least conflictive relationship with darkness. Our ancestors used to live around the sun cycle during the day and twilight at night, using their eyes' ability to adapt to perform activities under dim light. In other words, embracing darkness. Although today our lifestyle and needs have evolved and are very different from those in the past, we must not forget that the eye's ability to adapt to different light intensities is still the same. Looking at this graph in terms of numbers by William M. C. Lamb, It shows the wide range of brightness levels the human eye can experience, making evident its ability to adapt to multiple light conditions, going from low luminance levels in dark night to 10,000 times more light in a bright sunny day. Understanding this property of the human eye is critical to introduce darkness in a space.
And the eye's dominant role prevails in our culture. Historically, light and sight have been interrelated and understood as synonyms, where light meant seeing and darkness the impossibility of seeing. Additionally, light has been directly linked to the action of seeing and darkness to our sense of touch. As an example, you may remember that the Greeks' theory of light was centered on the human vision, and many of their successors followed the idea that light itself was emanated from the eye as a metaphor to see the world. As a consequence of this train of thought, the inherent link between light and darkness began to disappear. And this is how the Western culture has been dominated by the model of ocular centrism, meaning simply that we have focused on the visual system as the primordial mean to understand our world. This philosophy has conditioned our architecture and contemporary city, suppressing the multisensory essence of our environments and causing an imbalance in our cognitive system. The reduction of the rest of the senses and the focus only in our visual system creates a gap between us and the world that surrounds us.
In particular, today, we focus on the sight through fields such as electric lighting, which is constantly reinforced by the countless technological innovations that promote brighter and perhaps better sources. As a result, we live now in over-illuminated spaces and cities that appeal mainly to the sense of sight and neglect the use of all the other senses. It is worth mentioning as well that in our current practice, the lighting recommendations and standards contribute to reinforce this tendency in pro of light and unfortunately against darkness. As a proof, we can look at this graph that compares lighting recommendations for office spaces between Russia, the UK, and the US between the years of 1930 and 1960. It becomes evident how the light levels increased throughout the years. However, why if 100 lux were enough in the 30s, today we require over 300 lux to perform the same type of activity or task? While it is true that the space properties, the finishes, the way that we perform the task have changed, again, we should remember that the eye's ability to adapt remains current but nonetheless neglected.
As evidence of this trend, we selected a couple of projects by professional lighting designers that reveal this condition. The first example is this parking space. What do you see? We could assume that light was meant to promote clear orientation and safety. However, the lack of a spatial hierarchy denies the volumetric properties and the space is perceived as flat. Regardless of the design intention, in a space like this, one could feel disoriented and maybe unsafe.
Our second example is this automobile showroom, where the high light levels give the impression of being inside a clear bubble. The uniform brightness, the lack of shadow, and the absence of depth makes the space feel disorienting, and far from using light to enhance the architecture, it becomes hard to read its special qualities.
Please don't get us wrong. We recognize that certain light levels are required to perform activities in interior spaces. However, increasing the amount of light is not synonymous with greater or better productivity. In this graph, we can see on the vertical axis the percentage of people's effectiveness to perform specific tasks. On the horizontal axis, the amount of luminance the eye perceives from the work surface. We have around 57% ability to perform a task at very low light levels. When the light level increases 10%, we reach a 78% ability to perform the same task. However, from this point forward, every time we increase 10% the amount of light, people's ability to perform the task only increases by 3%. We observe that even though the performance increase at the beginning is substantial, we reach a point where the increase of luminance doesn't impact the performance meaningfully.
We understand that lighting recommendations are an integral part of our practice. However, proposing design solutions based only in these parameters limits creativity, flexibility, and exploration during the design process. To enable exploration, we need to be aware that designing quality light goes beyond providing light for the sake of seeing, beyond producing spaces that appeal mainly to the sense of sight. Approaching design from this quantitative perspective frames lighting as a visual product only, disconnecting it from the inherent temporality and depth that darkness and shadow bring into space.
Continuing with this idea of temporality and depth, we should also remember that darkness will enhance materiality. Darkness will reveal other elements and features that we seldom recognize in flat, over-illuminated spaces. By consequence, this triggers our multisensory experience, and most importantly, it creates a new rhythm of perception, one that shows us the space in a very unique way, allowing us to see, yes, but also feeling the space around us. We would like to invite you all to consider the poetic experience of darkness that will spark this participation of the observer.
The main question becomes then, how to recover the poetic value of darkness in lighting design. Our goal is to prove that it is possible to embrace darkness attributes in our practice. Let's see what Florencia and I are talking about. We propose to recalibrate our design process, recognizing that darkness and light have equal value as creative tools.
Going back to this diagram, what if we select some words that could talk about both qualities of light and dark?
Then, what if we remove the notions of positive and negative and start thinking of this as relative values, not good nor bad, but complementary to each other?
With this base, we propose to consider darkness as a vast spectrum with multiple nuances and intensities, composed of different tones such as dim light, soft glow, and penumbra. When we recognize darkness as a relative condition with the same value as light, we'll start dissipating the pre-existing negative notions around it, and we'll welcome the possibility of exploring it in our creative process.
To reinforce the idea of relative values in the spectrum that Florencia mentions, we want to convey that each of these qualities of light and darkness shown in this diagram can represent multiple possibilities in a space. The presence of darkness is not absolute. On the contrary, it allows unlimited ways of expression when interacting with light. Altogether, as we have mentioned before, the spectrum begins to reveal other features, establishing a new rhythm of experience.
An effective way of introducing the application of the light to dark spectrum is through contrast and contrast ratios. In this table from the IES handbook, we can see the different moods that could be created depending on the ratio of dark and bright from subtle to strong. This gives us a better understanding of the relative condition of darkness. A good example of this is the diagram on the right side. Looking at the smaller squares, do you think they are the same or different shade of gray? Actually, although they look different, they are exactly the same, but depending on their background, bright or dark, they seem different to our eyes. This is how we can start to think about light and darkness.
Another important factor when introducing the spectrum is to recognize that each space and program has different constraints and requirements. As we all know, we wouldn't recommend the same amount of light for an office space than for a lounge. From here, we can start to identify the best suited ratios for each type of application. For instance, a dramatic contrast ratio would work best for retail or hospitality. A moderate contrast ratio would enhance transitional spaces, whereas an office environment would require only a subtle or soft contrast ratio. We've determined that darkness as a spectrum is as valuable as light itself in the creative process. We have also established the importance of multisensory experience in space. Now, for the application part, we want to demonstrate how beneficial the intentional use of darkness is within a space. We have identified four main contributions or benefits. First, it appeals to our collective memory. Second, it could provide spatial shelter. Third, it could help build a visual information system or suggest movement and depth. These benefits can be achieved successfully through the use of darkness as spectrum. We'll explain further through case studies.
The first benefit of designing with darkness is related to our collective memory. As we discussed in the beginning, darkness and shadow links us to our past. We used to live in a world of long flickering shadows, dark voids, and a warm glow. This memory is deeply rooted in our psyche and provides strong associations with ideas of comfort and domesticity. Moments around candlelight or a fireplace are evidence of this notion. Thomas Wilfred, in his work Clavilux, used light, color, and movement to create depth and different saturation intensities. Here, darkness acts as a background to the pieces, where one can appreciate the ephemeral and dynamic qualities of light. A similar experience to the contemplation of a candle and its flame. Similarly, Anthony McCall, in his series Solid Light Works, uses darkness to reveal a series of ethereal volumes. In this case, light and dark have a presence of equal value, creating a very particular rhythm in a space. During the exhibitions, spectators are attracted to meet around the sculptures of light, in an act of collective synchronicity comparable to the experience of gathering around a bonfire. Finally, Olafur Eliasson, with his installation The Weather Project, turns light into the main object of contemplation. However, the contrast of the intense brightness with its surroundings in twilight creates a unique experience. The spectators in silhouettes provide another layer of contrast into the experience, generating a moment of collective encounter, similar to the experience of looking at the sunset in nature.
The second benefit, spatial shelter, intends to tackle the most relatable misconceptions. Darkness is unsafe and high light levels are comfortable. We propose the use of darkness to allow anonymity and let users enjoy moments of privacy and tranquility, using it to provide spatial shelter to support the stillness and serenity needed in certain spaces. This idea counteracts the belief of lack of security in low light and provides a positive aspect to the use of darkness. At the MIT Chapel by Saarinen, we recognize the use of darkness to draw attention to detail. The intentional use of under-illumination embraces the visitors and supports eye adaptation from the soft glow at the perimeter to the focal point at the skylight, creating in between a threshold of dim light for contemplation and shelter. There isn't too much light, but the space is very dynamic. Remember how the bright light from a tall pole light fills at a parking lot. Even though there is enough light, the glare from the luminaire obscures our visibility. At the Highline by l'Observatoire International, darkness is applied successfully to create the opposite effect, reinforcing the value of darkness for what it reveals and not for what it conceals. The fixture locations, the dim light, and the use of low-glare luminaires supports eye adaptation, allowing the visitors to appreciate the space and its surroundings. This solution keeps the park safe and reconciles safety and darkness.
Another benefit is the use of darkness as a source of visual information. On the one hand, shadow and contrast naturally brings messages with them. Their intensity and length can inform us about the sense of time and place. They can also contribute to spatial legibility and orientation. On the other hand, shadows can also provide symbolic information related to the use or intention of a space. In this chapel by Luis Barragan, the interaction of color, materiality, and shadow expand the meaning of a space. The dynamic shadow of the cross projected on the wall moves as time passes, bringing to the interior the element of time and reinforcing its spiritual character. Altogether, these components reveal to the viewer the symbolic content of the space. In this second example, by Le Corbusier, the play of contrast revealed the materiality and depth of the architectural massing. In this case, shadow helps us to understand the texture, the character of the materials, and the orientation of the space. One could easily imagine the feeling of the concrete walls, how warm or cool they would feel under direct light or shadow. These elements in play allows us to experience multiple scenarios throughout the day.
The fourth benefit is movement and depth. Darkness also helps us to alter and modify our spatial perception. It can animate a scene, creating movement and depth, establishing fluidity and rhythm that heightens the multisensorial experience. When light and darkness intersect, they open the possibility of constructing multiple narratives in a space. At the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn, the play of light and shadow changes the space throughout the day. This dynamic play adds richness to the space, inviting the user to approach and experience new perspective and details each time. Darkness here becomes appealing, dissipating the misconception of fear to the unknown. In Robert Irwin's installation and the Chinati Foundation, the selection of materials and transparencies, in combination with the play of light and darkness, reveals depth between different planes and new spaces within spaces. Layers of darkness and light make the space boundaries expand, inviting the user to move and enabling multiple narratives in a space. Here, darkness and light interact to expand our limits of perception. At the General Motors Technical Center, Richard Kelly presents light and darkness as two pure volumes that define perceptual boundaries within the space. Darkness around the volume of light helps define the depth of the space and frames the user attention.
We have presented to you iconic pieces of architecture and art installations. With this, our goal is to demonstrate that the potential of underlighting as a design strategy, although unique, it's possible, but sadly is usually seen as inadequate for architecture. Our hope is that after looking at these case studies, you can also recognize the value in these four benefits. In particular, it is essential to see that darkness can be multifaceted, and it can be used to define different elements and to provide multiple experiences. More important, it enables a new rhythm of perception. To conclude, we consider that the virtues of darkness can be classified into two aspects, one that refers to the quality of a space and another that relates to the practical and quantitative aspect.
In the qualitative aspect, we have the importance of darkness for what it reveals and not for what it conceals. From the field of perception and experience, darkness slowly reveals what at first glance it's not seen. That is, unlike light that allows us to see it all at once. This application of darkness as a spectrum contributes to the spatial richness, stimulating all the senses and inviting us to be aware of the experience. Altogether, it allows to reestablish the intangible essence between them, giving access to the poetic field in architecture.
In the quantitative aspect, we conclude that there is a need to reevaluate the recommendations, to recalibrate our way of validating lighting design beyond the amount of light in space. It is true that there are recommendations dedicated to the understanding of perception. However, in our daily practice, we continue to give priority to the amount of light applied to each surface. Finally, the intentional use of darkness implies an automatic benefit in saving energy consumption, proposing to reduce the number of luminaires in a space, turning our design into a sustainable solution.
We would like to end our presentation with a practical guide that hopefully will encourage you to think about darkness as a creative tool.
Without having to follow any particular order, these strategies can introduce meaningful changes into our daily practice.
For example, from expanding our vocabulary and the way we refer about darkness,
to considering eye adaptation and contrast ratios,
or even just remembering that we are multisensory beings, we will be already shifting the conversation.
just remember to be creative, have fun,
and share with us if you are already doing any of these practices. Thank you.